Charles Dickens is one of those writers who has achieved timelessness, but in his own lifetime, Karl Marx numbered him amongst those novelists who have issued to the world more political and social truths than have been uttered by all of the professional politicians, publicists, and moralists put together. It was high praise, and we still hear shocking, grinding poverty described as Dickensian. And yet Charles Dickens also means Christmas. I thought about Dickens recently walking up O'Connell Street towards the Gate Theatre to see A Christmas Carol, because I remembered he had, I presumed at least, gone the very same way on his way to the Rotunda to read, you guessed it, A Christmas Carol. Dickens, the Freeman's Journal reported, made his appearance on the platform and was greeted by a burst of applause, that which we have never heard anything more spontaneous, general, or enthusiastic. A Christmas Carol came initially from a place of outrage. He boldly claimed that he would write a piece that would serve as a sledgehammer for the poor. Not long after reading a famous, or maybe a better word is infamous, parliamentary report into the employment and conditions of children in mines and manufactories. Initially, he said he wanted to write a very cheap pamphlet called An Appeal to the People of England on behalf of the poor man's child. Instead, we got the play. And in Scrooge, we have the condemnation, I suppose, of a world where economics matter more than heart, where population theory matters over shared humanity.
Tell me, what day is it?
What day? What's Christmas Day, Coaster?
Christmas Day. Christmas Day. Then I haven't missed it. The spirits must have done everything in one night. But of course, they can do anything, can't they? Of course they can.
A Christmas Carol was published in 1843, and by the end of the following year, 13 editions had been printed. It has never been out of print. The surviving accounts of the visits made to Dublin by Charles Dickens are packed full of colour. He came here on 3 occasions, 1858, 1867 and 1869, just a year before he died. He packed in Irish audiences on these speaking tours, and also a prolific letter writer. He left behind brilliant letters from Morrison's Hotel, we'll talk about where that was in a bit, and the Shelburne, that are packed full of little details about the city. And it really shouldn't be surprising to us that Charles Dickens was a great observer of the people around him. As much as this story is about him, it's also the story of, I suppose, his own entourage. George Dalby, his tour manager for the latter visits anyway, whose Charles Dickens, as I knew him, is also full of fantastic little details about the Dublin visits. Dalby, as you might expect, the tour manager of one of the most famous men in the world, lived a good life. One account, well, until the death of Dickens, one account of him has it that the incessant gorging and cocktailing, whiskey scouring, champagning, liquoring and other alcoholic frivolities had done their fell work. What fascinated me about Dalby's account of visiting Dublin in 1867 with Charles Dickens is that he centres the Fenians in his telling of the tale. That was the year of the Fenian Rising, brewing for some time in the background, and the city seemed to be on a real political edge when they arrived. This is a shorter edition of the podcast, and I want to tip my hat towards a very important book, Charles Dickens' Ireland, an anthology by Jim Cook. Jim, a great champion of Dickens, did something very important. He brought all these primary sources together, creating an invaluable book for anyone interested in the story of Dickens in Dublin or Ireland more broadly. And David Norris wrote the introduction back in 1999. He began with Charles Dickens is perhaps a little out of fashion now. It's a rare occasion that I disagree with David Norris. I think he never went out of fashion. From the age of silent cinema adaptations to contemporary twists. So this is the story of the visits of Charles Dickens. God bless us, everyone. When Charles Dickens first set foot on Irish soil in 1858, he was 46 years of age. Born at what was then 1 Mile End Terrace in Portsmouth, but more synonymous really with London and Fitzrovia, to where his family moved, there are aspects of his early life that explain his later focus. His father, John Dickens, would spend time in the debtor's prison, for example. And as a boy of just 12, He would work in a warehouse, earning 6 shillings a week by placing labels onto pots of boot blacking polish. It was not an environment he would ever forget, later telling one interviewer, "The blacking warehouse was the last house on the left-hand side of the way at Old Hungerford Stairs. It was a crazy, tumble-down old house, abutting of course on the river and literally overrun with rats. Its wainscoted rooms, its rotten floors and staircases, and the old grey rats swarming down in the cellars, and to the sound of their squeaking and scuffling coming up the stairs at all times, the dirt and decay of the place, it rises up visibly before me, as if I were there again." His ability to capture that kind of world and the conditions in which the working class lived would shape his journalism and his literary output. The Prime Minister, Lord Melbourne, would write off Oliver Twist as little more than a book about workhouses and coffin makers and pickpockets. But other people recognised their social value. Not only were the works of Dickens literary works of great importance, but they had great political and social value too. Indeed, many years later, Jim Larkin would be asking in his newspaper, The Irish Worker, if certain Dublin employers had ever read Charles Dickens. The first announcement that Dickens was coming appeared in Dublin newspapers. "Mr. Charles Dickens will read in the Round Room, Rotunda, Dublin, on Monday evening, August 23rd, 1858 at 8 o'clock, his Christmas Carol." Over the following 3 nights there would be further readings of works including Chimes and The Poor Traveller. When he arrived for that very first visit, with then manager Arthur Smith in tow, they took up residence in Morrison's Hotel. Now, if you're wondering where that was, it was on the corner of Nassau Street and Dawson Street. Today, it's a Costa coffee shop. And look closely next time you're passing it on Dawson Street, and just about chiselled in, you'll notice mention of Charles Stewart Parnell, who stayed at Morrison's frequently and was arrested on that premises in 1881. But there's no marker to the fact Charles Dickens lodged there too. From that hotel, he would write about Dublin brilliantly. "I am greatly surprised by this place. It is very much larger than I had supposed, and very much more populous and busy. Upon the whole, it is no shabbier than London is, and the people seem to enjoy themselves more than the London people do. The old town of Edinburgh is 1,000 times more squalid than the by-places I have seen in Dublin, and I've wandered about it for 6 or 8 hours in all directions. It may be presumed that it is greatly improved of late years." Interestingly, one reason Dickens presumed that Dublin might have improved was the decline of spirit grocers and alcohol in the city, the temperance movement, of course. The readings of A Christmas Carol, a great success. Dickens relied on nothing but his own presence, the Irish Times describing a simple presentation with just a small table covered with green cloth and having a stand for his book in the centre of the platform. "Ladies and gentlemen," he told the crowd, "let the first public words I've spoken on Irish ground be words of thankfulness to you for your cordial and generous welcome. You cannot, believe me, be more glad to see me than I am to see you." Dickens' readings involved impersonations of the characters and performance, and he was keen to avoid what he felt crowds expected. When you went to hear a famous man reading his text, what did you expect? In his own words, a man to be sitting down in some corner, droning away like a mild bagpipe. What's a mild bagpipe? The Chimes, another Christmas story published a year after A Christmas Carol, was warmly received the following night. And in many ways, The Chimes follows a similar narrative to A Christmas Carol. Its social commentary, supernatural visitations remind a man of the goodness in the world. This time, Toby Veck, a London porter. "We have no doubt," the Freeman's Journal reported, "but that many left the Rotunda last night with softened hearts, and minds more disposed perhaps than before to look with earnest sympathy upon the joys and sorrows of those beneath them. The man who can teach such lessons and produce such effects as these deserves to be ranked amongst the benefactors of his kind, and such a man is Mr. Charles Dickens." Dickens was amazed by the enthusiasm towards him in Dublin, writing about the city to his daughter from Belfast a few days later, and with a little bit, I imagine, of dramatic licence. "The moment I had come out the door of the hotel, a mile off, I'd come against a stream of people turned away. I had struggled against it to the room. There, the crowd in all the lobbies and passages was so great that I had a difficulty in getting in. They'd broken all the glass in the pay boxes. They had offered frantic prices for stalls. Belfast struck Dickens as being a very different city from Dublin. It was, he felt, a fine place with a rough people. Everything looked prosperous. The idea that a city could be at once better off than Dublin and worse off in character. He would return to that point in another letter from Belfast. The people are much rougher here than in Dublin, and there was a very great uproar at the opening of the doors. By the time of Charles Dickens' return to Ireland in 1867, he was now lodging in the Shelbourne Hotel, which had very much overtaken Morrison's as Dublin's most fashionable hotel. Curiously, this was March 1867, just days after the failed Fenian rising in the mountains and fringes of the capital. The fear of another standoff was real, and it was felt that St. Patrick's Day could be the day for a second attempted Fenian uprising, a day when Charles Dickens would be in Dublin. George Dalby, who was now managing Charles Dickens on tour, would later write that it was a time when the city was in a state of semi-siege owing to an anticipated Fenian rising. Mr. Dickens, he noted, was desirous that the trip be cancelled. On arriving at Kingstown, we had a taste of the anticipated rising in Dublin, in the stoppage of some of our baggage there on the quays. The police, seeing some unusual-looking cases amongst the ordinary luggage of passengers, could not imagine that the box containing our gas piping could be anything but firearms for the use of Fenians, and insisted, in spite of our protests, on having it searched before they allowed the box to be put in the train. When nothing but the innocent gas piping was discovered, the breathless bystanders seemed quite disappointed. When we got to Dublin, we could see that there were good grounds for alarm, the whole city being alive with constabulary and soldiery, and a visit to our local ticket agent on the following morning convinced me that for our first reading, certainly our house would not be very good. Of course, they needn't have worried. The Shelbourne was an environment that Dickens enjoyed. He wrote, "We are splendidly housed here and in great comfort." But he did have a sense of worry too. The drinking shops of the city, he noted, were ordered to close, and rumours abounded. He would write that there was considerable alarm here beyond all question. Large musters of soldiers and police, that they are kept carefully out of sight. Fenianism fascinated Charles Dickens and got plenty of column inches in his journal. He would write to his daughter of how one regiment has been found to contain 500 Fenian soldiers, every man of whom was sworn in a barrack yard. How information is swiftly and secretly conveyed all over the country, the government with all its means and money cannot discover. In 1867, massive crowds flocked to the Rotunda again, hearing Dickens read David Copperfield, a work that he would christen his favourite child. But A Christmas Carol also got an airing on that 1867 trip too. And remember, this is the middle of March, like the middle of March, and people are flocking to hear A Christmas Carol. When Dickens and Dalby took the boat back to England, Dalby remembered the presence of Fenian prisoners on their way to England for what he called safer custody. It was the nearest Dickens came to the Fenian rising he was so scared of. By his final visit, a year before his passing, there was a general acknowledgement it would be the last opportunity for the Irish public to hear Charles Dickens. And as Jim Cook highlights in his book, advertisement said, "The last that will ever be given by Mr. Dickens in this country," describing the readings. On the 11th of January, 1869, Dickens again read A Christmas Carol in the Rotunda. And he was, the newspapers reported, a little older than he was 2 years ago. Now to that I would say, aren't we all a little older than we were 2 years ago? His voice, the paper said, is a shade weaker, and his action more subdued than ever. His reading, however, is none the worse. Over 3 nights, huge crowds once more came out to hear Dickens. And recognising that there was a finality to this, the Irish Times said, "He has taught us in his recitations that the characters he portrayed partake less of fiction than of reality, and his efforts in the past will invest all his works with far greater interest in the hearts and minds of the many thousands of his admirers." For Dickens, such public readings came to an abrupt end in April 1869, when the order to arrest came from his doctors. He would die in June of the following year. And in the London Times, an obituary perfectly captured the enormity of it all by doing what Dickens had always done, placing ordinary people in the narrative. One whom young and old, wherever the English language is spoken, have been accustomed to regard as a personal friend, is suddenly taken away from us. Charles Dickens is no more. The loss of such a man is an event which makes ordinary expressions of regret seem cold and conventional. It will be felt by millions as nothing less than a personal bereavement. Statesmen, men of science, philanthropists, the acknowledged benefactors of their race might pass away, and yet not leave the void which will be caused by the death of Dickens. They may have earned the esteem of mankind. Their days may have been passed in power, honour and prosperity. They may have been surrounded by troops of friends, but however preeminent in station, ability or public services, they will not have been, like a great and genial novelist, the intimate of every household. Indeed, such a position is attained not even by one man in an age. It needs an extraordinary combination of intellectual and moral qualities to gain the hearts of the public, as Dickens has gained them, a defining obituary. The writings of Charles Dickens had extraordinary cultural impacts in their day. Frank Hopkins, brilliant urban historian of Dublin, has written that even some of our street names in the 19th century in this city were shaped by Dickens. A cul-de-sac in Dublin's Monto district, whatever you think of that, was named after Nicholas Nickleby, and Pickwick Place on Great Strand Street, Frank tells us, after the Pickwick Papers. There's always time to read Dickens. During the Second World War, the Irish Monthly told their readers one of the most remarkable changes which wartime conditions have brought about in literary life is rediscovery of the classics. Booksellers, publishers and librarians tell us that Dickens has come again in fashion, even with young people. I still remember a time, the writer said, when a Dickens lover got just as dirty looks as an admirer of Thomas More is at present getting in Ireland. I noticed that one of the actors in the Gate Theatre's excellent take on A Christmas Carol is Emma Kerwin, ambassador for Focus Ireland's No Child Without a Home campaign. And if we honour Christmas in our heart and try to keep it all the year, let's hope for progress on that front in the times ahead.